Hello and welcome to the Crime and Punishment section of our GCSE revision. Crime and Punishment is the first assessment or exam that you will sit after half term, and it's worth 25% of your overall GCSE grade. It is worth a total of 40 marks, and you will sit this paper for 1 hour. The questions that you can expect to meet are those 3 knowledge questions, clear and organised summary, an explain question, and there are 2 how far do you agree questions for 18 marks. You either do 4 or you do question 5. You don't do both of them. Hopefully you found me by scanning your Crime and Punishment QR code here. This will take you all the way through, but if you think, do you know what, I don't need to revise the medieval period, feel free to scan the QR code in your booklet and it will take you to the timestamp for the correct time period. So let's make a start and we will do the medieval period. So the medieval period is the earliest time period that we study. I would advise that what you do is as soon as you get into that exam, you write the time periods across the top of your exam paper. So the medieval period is 1250 to 1500. And we're going to start by looking at crimes. Now, what I would suggest is you think of 3 of each of these that you can remember. So, for example, in the medieval period, the most common crime is petty theft. Now, you want to make sure that you have 3 crimes in mind, you have knowledge about those crimes, and you also can tell me why is that crime rate so high or why is this new crime introduced. Because if you need to write a summary question or an explain question, you need that explanatory knowledge. So, petty theft, it is 80% of all crimes. It is the theft of goods worth less than 12D. If you need to pause at any time just to catch up with me, that's absolutely fine. Why is it so common? Or why is it such a high crime rate? This is due to the reliance of people on the harvest. Quite often, harvests can fail. People get desperate, and therefore they steal to survive. So if a harvest fails, people become desperate. If you find that these mind maps are maybe not big enough, I'm already struggling a little bit, do work on a different piece of paper, that's absolutely fine. Just wanted to make sure it was all together in a booklet for you. Another crime from this time period is homicide. Homicide, or known more likely as murder. Now, do try to use the word homicide rather than murder. Now, we know that homicide happens throughout all the time periods. However, the reason why we mention it and remember it from the medieval period is that it is 18.2% of all crimes in this time period. And that is high. That is a high homicide rate. And it's that bit that you need to do the explanation for. Why is it so high? Now, there's a number of different reasons why it's so high. Number 1, suicide is considered homicide. So the suicide rates are counted in the homicide rates. Number 2, there is also no or very little medical care. So there is a lack of awareness of infection and effective medical care. Any violent crime against a person, even if it's not meant to be murder, can easily become murder as people die due to infection. So people die from violent crimes due to infection. Now, there are a whole range of other crimes that you could also look at in this time period. So, for example, treason is introduced for the first time, or properly defined for the first time. We've also got the introduction of vagrancy. Now, I would probably be tempted to stick with treason for this one, just so you don't get confused between vagrancy starting and vagrancy increasing in the early modern period. So we'll go for treason. And treason is attempting to kill the king, or actually succeeding in killing the king. I've also got petty treason, which is killing your husband. And treason and petty treason are seen as the most serious crimes. Why are they seen as the most serious crimes? Well, that's because the king is the head of the country, and you need to try and keep control, so it needs to be serious and stop people from attempting to kill the king. But why is killing your husband treason? Well, just like the king, the husband is the head of the family. It's a patriarchal society. The man is in charge of the household, just like the king is in charge of the country. So therefore, it is a serious crime to kill your husband. So we'll just write that down. So why? The king is the head of the country. His control is not secure. Needs to keep himself safe. And then the petty treason, patriarchal society, or if you can't remember patriarchal, male dominated. Husband is the head of the family. So if you do need to pause anytime, like I said, do feel free. You can just pause and get yourself caught up. We're going to move on now to law enforcement. Like I said, with crimes, there are a number of other ones you can look at. Vagrancy begins after the Black Death. Scolding is another one of them. But these are the three that I would say I would remember, because you can explain why they are crimes at the time. Same with law enforcement. There's a large range of different things that you can write about in law enforcement. You can either write about law enforcing the law through policing or through the use of courts. So one person I think is very important in law enforcement in the medieval period is the sheriff. And he is the king's agent in each county. And he's usually a local lord. And it's his job to ensure and enforce the law in his county. And he also collects the fines for the king. Now, why do we have this sheriff who's a local lord? So we're going to look at why are they used. This is because the king cannot control the country on his own. He needs his supporters to help keep that control. So he needs his supporters to help keep the control. Another method of law enforcement that we could look at is the hue and cry. And the hue and cry is the people. And if a crime is committed, The person who is the victim shouts for help, and everyone has to chase the criminal. So the victim shouts for help, and everyone has to chase the criminal. Why do they use this method of law enforcement? Well, there's no professional police force because it's too expensive. No professional police force, too expensive, and people live in very small local communities. So everybody knows each other. It's quite easy to identify the criminal. And people live in small communities. Easy to identify. Oh, my writing. The criminal. If you can't read what I'm writing, I apologise. Just pause, rewind and listen to what I've said. But it says people live in small communities, easy to identify the criminal. So we've looked at two types of law enforcers, but there's also another section to law enforcement, and that is the courts. Okay, now there's a change in the courts, which I think is the good one to remember for the medieval period. So I'm just going to try and pop it up here at the top. And we have the introduction of the county assizes. And this is where royal judges from London visit each county two to three times per year. The county assizes are introduced in 1293 to take over from the royal court. Now the county assizes only try the most serious crimes, but they take over from the royal court as the royal court is unable to try all the crimes, and it's becoming ineffective. So the last thing we're going to look at is punishments. There are a range of punishments used in the medieval period. One that we know is not really used very much is imprisonment. So do not write about prison in the medieval period. It is only used for people waiting for trial, waiting for the punishment, or people who are in debt. The most common punishment is a fine. So fines are the most common punishment. These are usually used for petty crimes. And why do they use fines? It's simple. It also makes money for the king or the lord, wherever the crime has been committed. And it's supposed to deter the criminal from committing another crime. A common punishment for serious crimes is capital punishment, and this is execution. There are a range of methods of execution used in the medieval period. So, for example, hanging, throwing off the cliffs of Dover. It all depends on the local variation. Why do they use capital punishment? Well, two reasons. One, it removes the criminal from society. Can't do it again. And another reason is that it's meant to deter other criminals from committing the same crime. And the executions are very public, so they try to that other people see it happen and think, right, I better not do that. Puts them off. One final punishment, and I'm going to have to find a little bit of space up here in the corner. So one final punishment is corporal punishment. For example, whipping or branding. This punishment is often used for crimes that have offended the local community. So, for example, selling underweight bread or something like gone off ale. So, used for crimes that affect the local community. Why do they use crimes like this? Well, first of all, it feels like just punishment for the community. So the community feels like punishment has been done. They don't want to take the law into their own hands. And again, deter other criminals. So shortly we'll move on to the early modern period. If you do want to skip it because you're quite happy with the early modern period, do feel free to scan the QR code on the opening page of Crime and Punishment, and it can take you to any of the other topics.